Ryan, what's on your radar?
So Abraham Lincoln was dogged throughout his career by an unseemly moment that almost cost him his life. So it was 1842, and Illinois, under Democratic control then, announced it would no longer accept state currency to pay debts. There was no national currency yet, and the decision to accept nothing but silver and gold made the state's paper money basically worthless. Lincoln, then a 33-year-old state legislator, never passed up an opportunity to attack Democrats, and he lit into the Democratic state auditor, James Shields, a close ally of state kingpin Stephen Douglas, over the decision. But as was strangely common at the time, Lincoln did it under a pen name, Rebecca this time, and played off of drunken Irish stereotypes, mocking him as well as a womanizer, writing, quote, "His very features in the ecstatic agony of his soul spoke audibly and distinctly, 'Dear girls, it is distressing, but I cannot marry you all. Too well I know how much you suffer, but do remember, it is not my fault that I am so handsome and so interesting.'" Lincoln's wife, Mary Todd, penned a poem under the same name, joking that Shields and, quote, Rebecca had gotten married, quote, "Ye Jews' harps awake, the auditors won, Rebecca and the widow has gained Aaron's son." And that was a poem that was then published in the local paper. It was all too much for the auditor, and he demanded his sullied honor be satisfied by a duel. So Lincoln chose swords, thinking his length would guarantee him a win, not knowing his opponent was actually a master swordsman. Now, fortunately for Lincoln, a friend of Mary Todd's, the local congressman, arrived in time to mediate the dispute, and the swords were sheathed. Now, the two had met in front of a crowd of hundreds on a sandbar in the Mississippi known as Bloody Island, since Senator Thomas Hart Benton had killed a political opponent in a duel there in 1817. The island was chosen because it was not part of either Illinois or Missouri, both of which had banned dueling. So the dueling ban was progress. It was considered a barbaric relic of the honor culture of the Middle Ages and its aristocracy. The code of honor was slowly being rooted out of American political culture. It did not go quietly, and a casual look at American culture over the past several years suggests it's now surging back. Now, the fight against dueling was waged by social justice advocates who pushed the country forward in a number of battles, some of them just and righteous, abolition and universal suffrage, and some of them, I'm thinking of the temperance movement and prohibition here, righteous, but a little bit muddled. Now, one of the leading abolitionists of the time was former President turned Representative John Quincy Adams, who in 1838 was serving in Congress when two members, a Kentucky Whig and a Maine Democrat, dueled over a trivial insult that didn't even involve either of them directly. The first two shots missed, and they declared it over, but Representative Henry Wise, a strident pro-slavery congressman, insisted on a second round. Honor-bound, the congressman agreed, and the gentleman from Maine was killed. In the uproar that followed, Adams introduced and passed a bill to ban dueling in D.C. Author Sidney Blumenthal, in his book A Self-Made Man, which is a portrait of Lincoln from 1809 to 1849, writes that Adams, quote, "considered dueling, its code, and the Southern concept of honor nothing but an appendage of slavery." For Adams and other Northerners, it was a relic of the worst elements of the aristocracy, false virtue to mask real evil. And it was the antithesis of the American spirit, which they saw as linking virtue to freedom, hard work, and success. So 3 years later on the House floor, Adams attacked Wise and linked his support of slavery to his backing of nullification and dueling. Adams wrote in his diary that night, quote, "At the close of his reply, his gang of duelists clapped their hands and the gallery hissed." So the local Whig papers excoriated Lincoln for his barbaric display, even though it was called off, with one paper dubbing it, quote, "the calmest, most deliberate and malicious species of murder, a relic of the most cruel barbarism that ever disgraced the darkest periods of the world, and one which every principle of religion, virtue, and good order loudly demands should be put a stop to." Now, 19th century politics, even excepting for the Civil War, were extraordinarily violent in comparison to today. Honor culture insisted that a slight to one's honor or to the honor of a lady could only be satisfied by an expression of violence. And that expression of violence then validated the man's position on the hierarchy, far more than any meritocratic calculus may have done. Cultures of honor differ in characteristics from rural Ireland to Afghanistan to the antebellum South, but all revolve around the idea that violence is an honorable solution to a social problem or provocation. Not all slights were met with organized violence. In The Field of Blood, A History of Violence in Congress, Joanne Freeman documents dozens of 19th century congressional canings, pistol whippings, knifings, and fistfights. Public displays of violence accelerated into the Civil War and also brought the war to a head faster. 1856, abolitionist Senator Charles Sumner was caned to within an inch of his life by a Charleston, South Carolina Congressman, Preston Brooks, who said Sumner had besmirched the honor of his relative and of the South. To escape censure, he resigned, but then ran in the next special election and won in a landslide. In 1858, a pro-slavery judge in California challenged an anti-slavery Democratic Senator, David Broderick, to a duel. Broderick's pistol was rigged with a hair trigger, and it fired as soon as he picked it up, so that counted as his shot. The judge then took his time and aimed squarely at his chest, murdering him. About 30 years later, the same judge actually tried to kill a Supreme Court justice and was himself killed by U.S. Marshals. Now, 2 years before that killing, a reporter ended the career of a congressman by exposing an affair. The congressman became a lobbyist, as they do, and the two saw each other regularly in the Capitol, and the former congressman would tweak his nose or pull on his ear whenever he saw him. One day, the reporter came armed to the Capitol, confronted him on the stairs just off the House floor, and shot him dead. Bloodstains still mark that stairwell. Dueling and the need to prove one's honor violently was a relic of the aristocratic honor culture, and it cut against the idea of meritocracy. So duels finally fell out of favor as modernity set in. Where the meritocracy took hold, honor culture was slowly eradicated. Violence became an unnecessary way to prove merit, and indeed it proved the opposite. But in places that haven't seen that meritocracy take hold, for instance, poor and working class areas where no amount of merit is going to get you out, honor culture has persisted with more strength than in the suburban homes of the well-educated. The way to know which side of the line your neighborhood is on depends on whether there are universally understood fighting words or not.
Hey, you, let's fight.
Them's fighting words.
Yet we're now seeing honor culture return to cultural spaces that had once been colonized by meritocracy. Now, why Will Smith slapped Chris Rock at the Oscars is beside the point. What matters is that Smith found many of his most vociferous defenders among the well-educated demographic that in a previous political era would have been leading the fight against dueling. One of the great successes of the movement against dueling and honor culture was to remove speech from the terrain of violence. Words, even vicious, insulting ones, could be exchanged without either party feeling it necessary to honor themselves by responding violently. But now words are said to be violence themselves, and therefore can justifiably be met with violence. The collapse of support for free speech and the willingness of so many progressives to support violence in the defense of honor suggests perhaps that the triumph of meritocracy was never real, that it merely replaced aristocratic honor with a temporary new mode of sorting power. And now that the sorting is so transparently at odds with actual merit, with power concentrated among the very rich and their children, the culture is reverting back to honor as a more useful store of social value. Say what you want, at least it's an ethos. Although it doesn't apply to everybody, the Illinois Press later revealed, according to Blumenthal, that Mary Todd had been the author of the most offending lines of poetry. Quote, "Miss M.T. wrote them in the parlor of her friend, Miss J.J., for fun," the Telegraph reported. Quote, "No challenge will be sent in this case, the author being a female. The code does not require it."
No lady duels.
No lady duels. Isn't that nice? How honorable.
Nice for them, yeah. Although now that gets into some weird, given our new understandings of gender and who you can just be what gender you say you are. But
right. So I guess in our new honor culture,
that would not be very honorable, I
right.
guess, to escape a duel by saying I now identify as a woman.
Right. No, that would
probably be like losing the duel. Yeah.
But so is this really where we want to head? And
no.
And maybe we don't have a choice. Maybe this is all, built for us by the structural conditions that are producing a kind of culture that doesn't give people any sense of fairness. And in a space where there's no fairness, then we turn to violence.
I remember reading in Steven Pinker's great book on the decline of violence, The Better Angels of Our Nature. And he writes about how violence has declined over the historical period in a lot of ways that are not obvious to us because we tend to say things are getting worse. And sometimes things are getting worse in various categories. Crime actually does seem to be getting a little bit worse, but was collapsing for a long time. And he writes about how warfare, those kinds of violent deaths, really have decreased over time in terms of what percentage of humans are going to die violently, right? Yes, our wars
used to be many.
Our wars kill lots of people, but they're actually killing a very small percentage of the population. Whereas, if you go back to ancient times, it's like most people are dying violent deaths, like most of all people on Earth. Anyway, he writes that he thinks the decline of dueling, and yes, there was legislation and everything, but it tended to follow, I believe I'm quoting him accurately, dueling just became disfavored or unpopular among like the next generation. Like younger, more tolerant people were like, why do old people want to kill each other all the time? Right. Stop, that's not
Lincoln
cool.
was ashamed of that to his dying day.
Yeah.
And it dogged him as every time he rose in politics. Say, you're that guy you were in that duel.
Yeah.
Gross.
So
because there was political and cultural opposition to it.
So my point being, I hope our next generation, resists this even more so, this kind of thing. But actually, I'm worried that they're not doing that, or at least that I see a certain number of activists who do want to conflate as I talked about on my radar, the words, actions, distinction.
Right.
And yes, that you should, on behalf of marginalized communities or whoever you're sympathetic to, you should wage violence, which is not a good idea. Bad.
Yeah.
Bad.
Bad.
All right, we had very much thematically agreeing radars today. Our rising panel will join us next.